Welcome back to Punchline. So, is the government doing enough to protect Kenyan jobs, Kenyan businesses and the Kenyan economy from the shocks of COVID-19? Is the virus and the resultant events enough to put our economy in the red, or were we there all along? Well, joining me now is the former governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Prof Njuguna Ndung'u, who is now the executive director of the African Economic Research Consortium. And good evening to you, Professor. Thank you very much for speaking to us on Punchline. Now, in your opinion, as a former governor of the Central Bank, where was the economy when President Kenyatta began his second term, and where is it now in the middle of this pandemic?
Thank you very much, because I think this is a very interesting question. One of the things is that your question is comparing the past and then the present. But I would like to say that it's always going to be difficult to compare two regimes in different political structures. But be that as it may also want to say that there's a spectacular difference from 2013. We have a devolved government. But the most important spectacular evidence is that the governance or the devolved government has not given us expectation. That is what we are likely to see as an institutional problem that has emerged. So in a sense, even though you could like to say let's compare the two, it's going to be difficult because they are different structures. But I think my emphasis is to say, where does the pandemic find us? Maybe that is a good way. But by the way, there is an echo. Should I?
You are okay. You're hearing an echo?
Yeah, I can hear an echo from my end.
You sound okay. Perhaps what you could do is, if you have a pair of headphones, you could put them on.
If I have?
A pair of earphones, it might help with the sound.
No, I don't have that. Anyway, no problem. If you can hear an echo from your end, that's okay. I was hearing it from my end.
Okay. Okay, so we'll start again.
Yes.
But please note on the question, I'm talking about President Kenyatta's second term. So you could start us off from 2017.
Yeah.
Not even the Kibaki regime. So devolution has already begun. You've had, yes. So let's compare where he was in 2017 and where we are now in the middle of the pandemic.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you much. And
Professor,
I think I can combine this in terms of
stand by.
Where the pandemic
Stand by. Stop. Stop.
Yeah.
Sorry, Prof. We have to start from the very beginning.
Okay.
Okay, so stand by. I'll introduce you all over again.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, stand by. And welcome back to Punchline. So is the government doing enough to protect Kenyan jobs, Kenyan businesses, and the Kenyan economy from the shocks of COVID-19? Is the virus and the resultant events enough to put the Kenyan economy in the red, or were we there all along? Well, joining me now is the former governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, Prof Njuguna Ndung'u, who is now the executive director of the African Economic Research Consortium. And good evening to you, Professor. Thank you for speaking to us on Punchline. Now, in your opinion, as a former governor of the Central Bank, where was the economy when President Kenyatta began his second term, and where is it now in the middle of this pandemic?
Thank you very much. And let me say that it is actually interesting when we find ourselves in this pandemic. But let me relate things from all the way from 2016. Because essentially, our reaction and even salvaging ourselves from this pandemic very much depends on what are the factors, where we find ourselves. So first, there's a recession that started in 2016, and it has been ongoing. triggered by national and county governments failing to pay suppliers and contractors. And this has had three effects that are still with us. First is the constrained regulatory economy. Second is the collapse of retail trade. And third is the collapse of SME. Then the second thing that we find from then on is the interest rate capping. This is an issue I can dance the whole night talking about, because essentially the interest capping ignored the device. But we can see what has been the outcome. There are several analyses that have shown that it has robbed the economic growth between 0.75% to 3%, depending on various papers. So essentially, you can see that it has condemned the economy into a low equilibrium trap, low equilibrium growth trap. That is the interest capping. My point is that
a recession from 2016, there are those who'd push back on that and say perhaps we were having a slowdown, perhaps the economy was not expanding as one would have expected, but we were not seeing negative growth. How do you respond to that?
No. In a recession is not negative growth. A recession is a slow growth if you compare with the previous period. And what we're really saying is that what are the factors that produce this slow economic activity or slow economic growth? And I've started stating what are some of the cases. And one of them is retail trade, accelerated, and even SMEs, accelerated by lack of payments to suppliers and contractors, the collapse of major supermarkets like Nakumat and Uchumi, the interest rate capping that was brought in, believe that it would support, should I say, cheap credit to SMEs and households and farms. But the outcome was that it has robbed growth, Kenya's growth, in a range of 0.75% to 3%. Several papers have been produced to show this. All these factors are very, very important. And the second thing is that, of course, the fiscal space. Don't forget that in 2017, with 2 elections, it means that the fiscal space was diminished. Now, coming from there, then we have seen so many other factors: the desert low-cost innovation, the real sector growth, the collapse of the tea sector, the collapse of the coffee sector, the collapse of the sugar sector, the near collapse of the dairy sector. All these have contributed to the slow growth, or what you might call a recession. A recession is not negative growth, it's actually a slow growth. So the pandemic has found Kenya in a very weak position. But we also have some peculiar advantages that we can talk about, because even though we have found ourselves in a very precarious position when the economy is at its weakest point, we also have some advantages.
Right. Very briefly, if you would, what would those advantages be?
One of them is that it is a question of coping mechanism. We have seen that the coping strategy has been quite effective. One is because of the digital development in this country. It was very easy to ignite retail electronic payments, virtual banking system, e-government, e-commerce. It's much easier in Kenya than any other country in Africa today. And especially e-commerce, because we have seen that other countries will have to have developed to develop this. But of course, it would even have been better if we had finalized the Huduma data system, because essentially we would know who is where and who are the vulnerable and how to actually target them. The third thing is that government was already using the virtual electronic payment system targeting social protection way back from 2016. So in a sense, you can see a combination of targeted social protection, virtual electronic payment system, the Huduma numbers, actually ignite programs that can actually salvage most of the effects of the pandemic. And for us, these are very important in terms of how the economy is coping. Even though the coping mechanism depends on how this will be protracted, but these are important strengths. But the final one, I would say, is that the swift action in terms of taking action in terms of trying to flatten the infection rate. That is, flattening the infection rate is very important in containing the pandemic.
So what then would you say? You've already said we were in a weak position, not our best position, but we have a few advantages. What then would you say now is the impact of the nationwide curfew? I should say the nationwide curfew, yes, and the partial lockdown in Nairobi, Mombasa, Kwale, and Kilifi. And in particular, how would you relate this to what our projected growth will be? The CBK is now estimating that the coronavirus may cut economic growth by nearly 3.4%. Do you agree with that?
One, it is very, very difficult to actually project growth when you have a negative shock that is persistent, because it creates its own dynamics. And those dynamics are not necessarily positive, they are actually negative. A restricted travel, for example, Nairobi, Mombasa itself, in terms of economic contribution to the economy, would be in the range of perhaps slightly over 50%. That means that the hinterland to Nairobi and Mombasa are suffering. As we continue looking at first negative effects, secondly, the coping mechanism. So it becomes difficult actually even to project even a growth of 3.4%. I've seen numbers are changing every day from the IMF to the World Bank to Brookings Institution. It all depends on the information that you have. The next thing that can help you is that if we can parade those sectors that can be supported even in the middle of this pandemic, then we can see how much we can resuscitate and preserve growth. But it would be very, very difficult to actually say that the economy will decline growth by certain percentage. These numbers are changing every day. I would.
Professor, let me put it this way to you. How long do you think the country can sustain the current economic situation without there being irreversible damage to the economy?
That is also difficult to say because you can't say how long. Let's put it this way. It is only 3 counties that have been restricted. If today we find that the Minister of Health finds that the infection rate is flattening, it will be a hope to reopen some of the sectors. One. The second thing is that for those sectors that are functioning, they are stepping up their coverage just because of the advantages I talked about earlier. So in a sense, you may see on one side there's a very strong negative effect from the pandemic, but on the other side, we are seeing some rejuvenation in terms of where we're coming from. But let me say this, it's going to be very difficult if these restrictions continue in the next 6 months. It will be extremely difficult for the economy to recover in some years to come. But the beauty about it is that it is global. Since it is global, it means that the whole world will come together to try and galvanize their energies towards some reforms and even some reconstruction. So this is the way you should look at it, so that since it is global, it is unlike, for example, the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone and Liberia. They were alone in the process, and there was no amount of help that would come and reverse the situation overnight. To date, they are still suffering just because of that. But here we are, it is global. It means that all the energies will be galvanized to try and support ourselves across. But we have lessons that we have learned in terms of our weaknesses, in terms of economic diversification. I'm very happy that I can see all of a sudden our textile industry is coming up and preparing masks. All of a sudden, we thought that we could only import these masks. You can see this is the kind of positives that are coming up and are very, very important in terms of the development process and the coping mechanism for this pandemic.
We can even begin to see some sectors of the economy spurred at this time, and we'll talk about the ones that could benefit the most coming out of this crisis. But very briefly, if you would say, in less than a minute really, because you've said in your opinion we were already in a recession all the way back to 2016, is there then an overestimation, in your opinion, of what the impact of, like the shutting down of international flights or the possible loss of formal sector jobs, etc.? Is there an overestimation about its impact on the overall economy, which, as we know, is largely supported by the Juakali sector?
Yeah, I don't think I don't think I can say there is an overestimation or underestimation, because I haven't seen a very concrete structure of how to estimate that. Don't forget, I developed macro model for Kenya in 1999 to 2000. So essentially, that is the structure we take, and then look at which sectors are being affected, how is the investment being driven down, then we can project what is happening to the fiscal space and all that. But I haven't seen any kind of analytical structure. What we are seeing, and this is very important for me, is that we are seeing that different government agents coming up with disruptive solutions. What we really need right now are disruptive solutions without having, we cannot worry about what structure are we going to use. We're going to use coping mechanism with disruptive solutions, and that is what is going to help us. For example, the Kitui, a textile farm in Kitui is producing 60 million masks in a space of less than 2 weeks. That is a disruptive solution, because we'll never go back into importing the masks again. So this is the kind of examples that we're coming up with. And the other one is to say, then, because they are vulnerable groups, how do we come up with a strategy to salvage them? Let's not go back to, going to feeding them, because that's like what happened yesterday in Kibra. That's a mistake, because essentially that is not going to be a disruptive solution. That is going to create a worse situation. So essentially, this is what we are saying, so that when we come to estimating the numbers, we have to estimate the numbers when we have taken all factors into consideration.
Solutions, and you're referring to the event of Friday, I believe. But let me put it this way to you. We have had economist David Ndii, for instance, who has proposed a jobs lifeline fund of 1% of the GDP, or 100 billion shillings, to help keep people in jobs. There are others who have suggested an economic stimulus package for industry, which might involve quantitative easing. What do you think of these proposals?
Well, these proposals are grounded on the basis that they can see the direct effects, the direct positive effects. And now I know, for example, when I was setting you my write-up, I even gave you an example of Mwai Kibaki's government in 2003, and David Ndii was one of those people who were responsible in developing the blueprint. I supported that in different ways, and then the Vision 2030. And David Ndii again was part of it. Most important thing is that when you are navigating uncertainty, you want to look at what are the most severe effects, and that is why the job, your point about job, that is supporting jobs lifeline, is very, very important, because we know who are the vulnerable. Because if there is a shutdown, those people cannot get food on the table if they don't go to. Then how do you support them? But I would like to look at it in a more broader way. We need to go into utilities and see how we can support the prices of utility, the service of the utility, electricity, water, gas, oil, paraffin. Those are the things that the vulnerable groups are having problems with. And the second thing is we move into what kind of support can we give in terms of supporting consumption. And one of them is to go to, for example, the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, and see which industries are producing foods that are being consumed by those people who cannot even manage to go to work. Let's not go to LCPP as we have done in the past. That is a disastrous path. So it means that we have to have a targeted approach that has beneficial outcomes from what, and that is why David Ndii was giving like a 1% of GDP, that is to save shillings, 100 billion shillings. That would help people to retain their jobs. That's a very important thing because we have a targeted approach and we know how long and how much we are going to save. But we cannot move into targets that don't see direct results. We want to make sure that we have the direct result. Remember, saving lives is one of the most important thing here. It's one of the most important assets. If the economy has to recover, it has to recover with its people. But if we lose people, then it's going to be difficult even to justify the reconstruction in future. But that is where we are coming from. But I would like to see that there are so many estimates coming. But for me, I think we take step by step which are the severest sectors, severest people. If we have shut down or we have restricted movement in Nairobi, then we have to know exactly which people are more vulnerable. How do we target them? How do we get them? Yeah. What are they using? Because we don't want to go to individual household, but we can go to specific areas that the foods that they are consuming, the utilities, the foods, the cities.
Professor, let me hold you there. Why can't we go to specific households? For instance, in times of extreme drought or other natural calamities, we've seen direct cash transfers from the government to the most vulnerable. This data is already there. It is used, for instance, also for school feeding programs, etc. So the government does already know who is most needy. In terms of supporting the most vulnerable, would you be an advocate for that, for direct cash transfers first to the most needy households, and then you can go to sector by sector approaches?
Yeah, that's where I started. That's why I started saying that one of the advantages in Kenya is that we have had social protection programs, direct cash transfers to the aged using the virtual, the retail electronic payments platform. We have that. That's an advantage to us. Yeah. But my regret was that if the Huduma system, debt system was already ready, would have even increased that space. That's what I was saying. Right. So I'm not opposed to that. I'm actually saying if we had the Huduma number, it would give us the urban poor, where they are, what they do, and would be enlarge that target. So essentially, cash transfer is the most effective because it goes to specific to the households and does not leak. And secondly, because they know it is time of a crisis, they will use those cash transfers economically to the targeted areas that they are supposed to support their livelihood. Right. I am in support of that. My only regret is that if the Huduma system was ready, would have enlarged this and it would have been comprehensive.
As we wind up, and very briefly, sir, if you would, on the following issues, we've seen the government, pretty much allocate some 2 billion shillings for creatives. If it can afford that for that industry, what should it spend then in keeping other businesses open? And if you could speak as much as possible in absolute terms.
I didn't get that question. You are saying the 2 billion.
Correct, that the government has set aside to rescue those who are in the entertainment or creative business. So many Kenyans have been wondering that if there is 2 billion shillings that can go to that particular sector, then what should the government be committing to other sectors? And we know it hasn't been open on that information yet. Do you have any recommendations?
I would just say first, I think if I had some money to target specific institutions, specific activities, I would first of all support the food producing companies. Let's say cereals, those foods that are consumed by the urban poor, because they are the ones that are restricted from movements. And we would to say, which is the best mechanism? The best mechanism is support the production farms. Not NCPB. NCPB is a deadweight loss to the whole economy. It has really punished the whole economy for many years, from 1973. You can start the history of its reconstruction. But if you go to specific, for example, the Kenya Association of Manufacturers can provide us who are the millers who deal with maize, wheat, rice. Then we can go now to milk industry. We know. And then we can target those and say that, look, we can give you some cash transfers so that you reduce your prices at the counter level. The second thing is that since there are restrictions in terms of movements, then we can actually now, I talked about disruptive solutions. We should have virtual shopping systems. And it happened in China. And it has been happening here. Food is delivered at home. So this is where we want to make sure that we salvage the situation by saving enough. But at the end of the day, we know that this can work. It is targeted. But when we go into a household and household, like the way I saw people want to deliver food to a particular group of people, there has to be a mechanism for doing that. And secondly, it cannot be sustained because you have to do that every day. But if you go into a farm that is producing maize flour, beans, all that, and target them and say that we want to reduce your retail prices so that we benefit the people in these times of crisis, that is going to be more sustainable. There will be savings. Right. And secondly, we'll still keep the production alive.
All right. Professor, I'm just being told online there's a lot of conversation, and I think this goes back to the debate that was ignited by David D's proposal in terms of a Jobs Lifeline Fund and others talking about quantitative easing. First, in very briefly, if you would, give us the differentiation between the government printing more money and this sort of notion that if more money is printed, it can sort of be, sent as M-Pesa to all of us, and quantitative easing, and whether it is something that you would recommend at this time.
There is one thing that we should always be careful of. You would rather introduce a solution that is not going to give you a negative consequence, which will be difficult to fight. If you print more money, you are going to introduce inflation at a time of scarcity. It means that you can have a spiraling inflation. To contain that, it is going to be more expensive to the same target group that you are saving than anything else. So I would not go that route of printing money. I would go to the route of quantitative easing, because in a sense, we are looking at two things here. Monetary policy must support fiscal policy, and likewise, fiscal policy must support monetary policy. How do we do this? I started by showing you the negative consequences of interest rate capping, because it maimed monetary policy. For the period, monetary policy has been banned. But the heroes of interest rate capping should know that they have actually condemned the economy so badly. So then we are left with a fiscal solution. The fiscal solution is the one that we are left with, and that is the one that is going to help us in terms of saying, suppose we want to support APC. What do we do? It is the fiscal solution that is going to be important. How we manage that in terms of the available resources, whether they are donations from the multilateral institutions, donations from individuals. Kenyans are willing to donate more money. They can come to the fiscal streamline, and that fund is managed in a sense that it is targeting those sectors that are going to help the economy. Right. But let's not go into print money, because we're going to create an inflation spiral that is going to be worse, to hit even the poor harder than anything else. And secondly, the stabilization to normality after the pandemic would be very, very difficult, and it will be very severe constraints. So we know that there are solutions out there. That's why I call them disruptive solutions. They are there. There are people who can provide them. Let's enlarge the net. And that's why the write-up that I gave you, I provided 4 solutions. And one of them, it is revolving around our vision for growth, target, and all that. We should stick to that vision. We should ask professionals. There are selfless professionals in Kenya who are willing to help the government to see how to repackage some of these policies to the fruitful end. Because most of the selfless professionals in Kenya are interested in positive development outcomes. They are not interested in positions in government. But unfortunately, because of the nature of the government structure since the devolved government came in, the professionals have been set aside, and obviously that is why we have limited knowledge. I keep going to the interest rate capping because it shows how intellectual poverty can ride over us, and we fail to see the big picture.
The other solutions, Professor, 3 quick ones, if you would, for President Kenyatta. What would your advice be to him?
I didn't get that. What do I advise?
What would your advice be to President Kenyatta at this time?
One of them is that we are running, the first thing is that we have learned that economic diversification is going to be most important solution in the long term. Second, I continue to advocate for domestic policy environment that allows for inclusive development. And this is where the success we have seen, especially for digital space, we have seen virtual financial services as viable examples. So it means that we can live into that. The third one is that it is now that we have to realize that we have internal strength and we can develop disruptive solutions. Those disruptive solutions have to revolve around utilizing our relative comparative expertise across counties. For example, revive sugar sector, revive the coffee sector, revive the tea sector, streamline the milk sector, streamline the rice sector. It's uncountable. And it can be done in the morning. The third thing is that we have to improve our fiscal space. This can only be improved by looking at our tax policy and even tax policy, tax designs. This is where actually taxes should be seen as an incentive to producers and households. But we haven't done that. So we need reforms. And finally, the success is actually driven by a vision. We had Vision 2030. We have to stick to it. It gives us the general picture in terms of where we are going. It galvanizes the population and our mutual friends internationally because they already know the path we are taking. We know the parameters, we know the outcomes, and we work towards the outcome. We have to go back to the Vision 2030 and redesign where we are. We can change the parameters because of changing circumstances, but a country that has no vision, then it has no direction. We have failed to emphasize this in the last couple of years, especially since the second term of the president. But we have come up with a few aspects of that. But we need to devise policy packages that are consistent with that. And this is where success will come from. Success will not come from political rallies. Success will come from those people who are allowed to do the practical planning, provide us with brilliant examples. And that's why I'm advocating for disruptive solutions. That is what will drive our economy.
Professor Ndung'u, that is our time. We thank you very much for your views, sir. Wish you well and stay safe.
Thank you very much, Anne. And I had written a very elaborate responses to your questions. So if you see my email and you want to add to it, you will find that it is quite conclusive.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll ask for your permission to publish it because I think you've said some very considerable things and it would benefit the public. I thank you very much for speaking to Punchline tonight.
Welcome and good night.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Time for us to take a short break. We're back with more news after this. Stay with us on Punchline.